Our third speaker this evening will be Chi-Jiun Albert Chang. He's from the Department of Political Science, and his talk is entitled Colonial Legacies in the Developing World.
Thank you. Well, that's a tough act to follow. When Singapore became an independent state in 1965, its future seemed bleak. Unemployment had skyrocketed, housing was crowded and filthy, and there were racial tensions among its multi-ethnic Chinese, Indian, and Malay population. Worst of all, a large proportion of the population did not have any formal education. But in spite of these obstacles, in only half a century, Singapore went on to become one of the most remarkable success stories of the developing world. This success can, in no small part, be attributed to very effective government policy, in spite of the fact that Singapore was an autocratic, one-party state. Unlike many dictatorships, the government of Singapore invested in mass education to create a skilled labor force. It built cheap and affordable public housing, and it formulated effective government policy that increased industrial output and reduced unemployment. Today, Singapore's per capita income equals or exceeds that of the United States and many European countries. But of course, this has not been the fate of many former colonies since independence. Many former colonies have had dismal economic performance since independence. As a political scientist, I research what are the characteristics of a state, such as how well the state collects taxes, for example, or how competent is the bureaucracy, that are beneficial for economic growth. I'm interested in this question of why there has been so much variation in the performance of states since independence, and why it is that of all the different countries that were formerly colonies, only a relatively small group has been able to catch up to the developed countries. One possible answer to this question lies in the legacy left by colonial rule. Of the 196 independent countries in the world today, about 80% experienced a period of colonial rule at some point in their history. Former colonies include some of the world's wealthiest, as well as some of the world's poorest countries. But at the time of independence, in the 1950s, almost all of them had the same initial level of income. So some were able to grow much faster than others and catch up with the developed countries. My research indicates that one of the most important factors in whether a colony was successful after independence is related to what I call the level of state capacity that the colony inherited from its colonial rulers. So what do I mean by state capacity? I mean, imagine a country in which even in the most remote rural areas, mail is collected, calls to 911 are answered, taxes are collected, I can't escape that one, all government services are provided, even in the most remote rural areas. So for example, the United States. But in many of the world's countries, this is simply not the case. There is no guarantee that many countries with low state capacity are able to respond to citizens' demands for effective public services, even if it has the best intentions. My research shows that if a colonial state had high state capacity in the last few years of colonial rule, and it was able to maintain this state capacity during the transition to independence, after independence, the state's new rulers were able to redirect what they had inherited from their colonial rulers to better public spending in areas such as healthcare, education, and welfare, domains in which colonial spending had been minimal. Under colonial rule itself, colonial rule itself was often very repressive and brutal. During colonial rule itself, state capacity served the interests of the colonial rulers. But after the transition to independence, the newly independent states were often able to redirect what they had inherited from the state infrastructure left behind from the colonial rulers, assuming that it had survived the transition to independence, and reoriented towards spending in social welfare and creating human capital that were crucial tools for creating economic growth. However, in many countries, the state capacity left behind by the colonial rulers was simply insufficient. For example, in many African countries, such as Kenya in this photo, and Zambia, the newly independent states were simply, even though they were democracies, were simply unable to respond to citizens' demands for increased public goods. These demands intensified after independence when these countries became democracies. But the inability of the state to meet these demands resulted in overspending, which created inflation and capital flight. As a result, many of these new democracies in Africa, for example, became in very short time dictatorships or one-party states. The devolution of many countries in Africa to one-party rule was partly a result of the weakness of the fiscal foundations which these African states had inherited from their colonial predecessors. On the other hand, some states, even though they were autocratic, such as Singapore, chose to respond to citizens' demands for improved public spending, perhaps to justify their own rule. And because of this inherited state capacity, they were able to do so. So some of these states, such as Singapore, as we've seen, became one of the most remarkable success stories of the developing world. So what can we learn from these countries that were formerly colonies? My research provides clues as to what kinds of investment states need to do in order to improve their citizens' standard of living. In states that had high capacity, which they inherited from their colonial rulers, were able to reorient this state capacity towards creating social programs and investing in human capital and investing in the health and welfare of their population, tools which were to prove crucial to future economic growth. So, when we think about what wealthy countries in the world today can do to help countries in need improve their citizens' standards of living, one of the most important things to remember is that they should invest in improving state capacity to improve their country's services and standards of living, thus resulting in a brighter future for us all. Okay.